In 1920, the Edinburgh city boundary was extended by Act of Parliament to take in the parish of Liberton, and with it the hamlet of Bridgend. This corner of South Edinburgh has long had a thriving community with its own individual identity. It also has a fascinating history. I'm John Novak, one of many volunteers at Bridgend Farmhouse, and this is my personal view of Bridgend, past and present. Bridgend sits just a short distance south from Camantoe roundabout and to the north of Craigmillar Castle Park, just opposite from the entrance to Inch Park. It's really just a cluster of Victorian cottages as well as Bridgend Farmhouse, and probably looks much the same as it did in 1920. Just to the north of Bridgend lies Edinburgh University Pethermill Sports Ground. The land used to be called the Meadows, or King's Meadows. At one time this was all poor marshy ground, but after it had been drained and improved it was put to agricultural use, and until recently the fields were used for grazing dairy cattle. Bridgend Farmhouse for a long time was at the heart of the local community. It's also a gateway to Craigmillar Castle Park, and sitting on the outskirts of the city, it's just 15 minutes from Princes Street. The original farmhouse was built in around 1750 and then extended to its present form in about 1830. Bridgend was a working farm until Harry and Doris Darling retired in the year 2000. Unfortunately, the house was left vacant and it became derelict. But in 2010, a small group formed a charity called Bridgend Inspiring Growth, and they raised enough money to restore and develop the building, and it is now a community hub working for the benefit of the local community. This map shows the location of Bridgend in relation to the surrounding area. Just beside Bridgend Farmhouse is the entrance to Craigmillar Castle Park, which leads up to Craigmillar Castle itself. Beside the farmhouse are the Bridgend community allotments, which look down onto the Pethermill playing fields owned by the University of Edinburgh. Across the old Dalkeith Road you can get to Inch Park and the Inch House, and eventually to the Camantoe shopping centre. The origin of Bridgend is unknown, but it is thought that it was named as the Craigmillar end of a sequence of bridges where Dalkeith Road, within the space of about 500 yards, crossed the Pow and the Braid Burns. This was a notorious area of marshy ground, and the bridges would have provided a safe crossing point for travellers going between Edinburgh and Newbattle Abbey to the south. So what do we know about Bridgend in the past? It's difficult to visualise, but over 700 years ago, the whole of this part of the south side of Edinburgh was covered in a dense forest, known as the Forest of Drumselch. The forest extended as far south as the Drum Estate and to Easter Craiglockett in the west. It was home to deer, foxes, hares and other wild animals, and since the time of King David I was a favourite royal hunting ground. We know that Bridgend was the site of a hunting lodge built in the early 1500s for the young King James V, and that it sat beside an even earlier chapel building. There's a reference in 1599 in the Register of the Privy Council of Scotland to Lady Bridgend. This probably indicates that the chapel was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Our Lady. The chapel at Bridgend was built in 1518 by Sir Simon Preston, Laird of Craigmillar, for the soul's health of King James III and King James IV. This no doubt would have helped him in life by pleasing the young King James V and his court. The chapel building may have looked fairly plain on the outside, but the interior would have been quite ornate. He built a second chapel of a similar design in 1523 for his own personal use at Craigmillar Castle, and this still stands there today. This old dilapidated building, sitting to the side of the farmyard, is thought to be all that is left of the chapel. As a chapel building, it had had a relatively short life. The Scottish Reformation in 1560 led to the destruction of many such religious buildings. It was eventually turned into a stable and then a farm labourer's bothy. It was then converted into a cattle shed and a pig shed, before collapsing into the ruinous state that we see today. We do have some physical evidence of the chapel's existence. A stone font was discovered by Harry Darling in one of the farm's outhouses, and is now in the care of Edinburgh City Museums. Seemingly, this old relic had survived through the years by being used as an animal feeding trough. And the question is often asked, what became of the hunting lodge? No one really knows, but it's possible to speculate that the original farmhouse was built over it. This carved stone panel, which may be from the hunting lodge, has survived and can be seen on display in the entrance to the Inch House Community Centre. The panel shows the Scottish crown placed over a shield with the lion rampant, and the letters JQ above the crown stand for the Latin name of James V, Jacobus Quintus. The original farmhouse at Bridgend was built during the period known as the Agricultural Revolution. It was of a common design and one of many such farmhouses springing up in the lowlands of Scotland at that time. A square, fairly basic building, it would have had a kitchen, a parlour, storeroom, pantry, a scullery and a milk house, with 3 bedrooms upstairs. At the time, this was looked on as a very modern building, a vast improvement on the very basic butt and bend type cottages of the previous generation of farmers. During the 1800s, Bridgend Farm was a successful and prosperous enterprise. The growth in the population of Edinburgh and the local area created an ever-increasing demand for farm produce, which Bridgend and the other farms in the area readily responded to. This engraving gives a view of Bridgend in relation to the city, which was expanding rapidly southwards. In 1920, as well as Bridgend, there were several working farms in the area. The closest of those was Davidson's farm, which was situated on Old Dalkeith Road, but just to the north side of the Braid Burn. Davidson's, like Bridgend, kept pigs, but also produced milk from a herd of dairy cattle put out to graze on a section of the meadows. By the 1890s, Bridgend Farm had developed into a prosperous, mature farm steading. Viewed here from the newly opened Edinburgh Suburban Railway line, we can see the extended farmhouse and the bothy, and the other farm buildings in the yard, as well as the rows of Bridgend cottages, which were soon to be demolished and replaced. This was Bridgend at the turn of the 20th century. You can see that there are still remnants of some of the older houses at the end of the street, just below the farmhouse. Old Dalkeith Road was an important highway in and out of the city, but it's obvious from this photograph that there wasn't a lot of traffic at that time. Viewed from the other direction, you can see on the left of the photograph the boundary wall to the Inch estate. The telegraph poles stretching out alongside the road show some sign of 20th century modernisation, but there are no street lighting lampposts, and the area must have still been quite dark at night. Some of the cottages were tied houses for the workers from the nearby Dixon's nursery, but we'll come on to that. This is a section of a map showing Bridgend back in 1920. In many respects, Bridgend is much the same today as it was then, but you can see from the map that some of the cottages had larger back gardens, where a few of the residents, no doubt, would have kept a pig or perhaps some hens. The map also gives us an idea of the size and the orderly layout of Dixon's nursery, which sat next to the Bridgend farm steading on its south side. The present-day houses at Bridgend were built in the 1890s by the Gilmour family, who owned the Inch estate. They replaced a row of older cottages that had become unfit for habitation. One of the residents has given us a lovely description of what life was like there in the 1930s and 1940s. What she said was, it was a very rural place and a very, very quiet place. Everybody was curious. They kind of knew each other, or they knew of each other. The people at Bridgend knew the people who worked at the Inch. Some of the Bridgenders worked in the Inch. Some of them worked for the nursery. They had tied houses. Dixon's Royal Nursery was just behind the farm, where the cemetery is. The Royal Nurseries of Craigmillar, or Dixon's Nursery, as it was more popularly known by, covered a large area of ground to the south and east of Bridgend Farm. The nursery operated for over 70 years and supplied the Forestry Commission with a range of native young trees. It also grew roses and garden plants for landscapers and for sale to the public. One of the nursery's important customers was Skibo Castle in Caithness, the Scottish home of Andrew Carnegie. When Dixon's closed down in the early 1960s, Harry Darling at Bridgend Farm was able to rent the land, and according to Harry, the land was second to none for growing the best barley and for shopping turnips. He also was able to keep a large herd of Aberdeen Angus cattle. This is a lovely photograph from the 1930s of one of Bridgend Cottage's residents, showing off the new member of the family. Even as late on as 1951, Bridgend was still quite rural in character and still relatively free of traffic. It's interesting to note that about this time that street lighting makes an appearance with the new lampposts at the side of the road. The modern-day story of Bridgend Farm really starts with George Binney in 1905, when he bought Bridgend House and started a dairy business with a herd of about 40 milking cows. George and his wife Margaret brought up 6 children in the farmhouse. This lovely family photograph of the Binney children was taken in 1912. The youngest, Chris, sitting at the front, was to inherit Bridgend Farm in 1938. This is George and Margaret's youngest daughter Jessie, photographed in 1935, wearing her best dress. Auntie Jessie, as she was fondly known, lived and worked on the farm for most of her life. George Binney employed a few workers to help tend the cattle and for the daily milking routine. Here we see Willie Cuthbertson, or Cubby as he was known. We don't know how or when he lost his right leg. Cubby was the farm labourer, and he lived in the bothy that sat nearby the house. Standing beside him is Jimmy Burnside, the stockman, and sitting peacefully between them is Monty, the infamously fierce watchdog. Chris Binney took over Bridgend Farm from his father in 1938. He is seen here in 1944 holding a walking stick, sitting beside the entrance to the house with his son David and brother Tom. The other photograph is one of the few images we have of the elderly Margaret Binney standing beside her daughter Jessie. Chris Binney was a successful keeper of pigs. Pigs were a welcome source of food during the 1940s and 50s, and Bridgend Farm supplied pig meat to the fleet of fishing boats at Granton Harbour and to a couple of butcher shops in Leith. Back then, pigs were fed mainly on domestic food waste, potato peelings and the like, and Binney's collecting lorry would have been a familiar sight going round the housing estates, picking up food waste from bins kept at the backs of houses. The food waste was then carried back to the farm, where it was made fit to feed to the pigs by boiling it up in large vats in one of the steading buildings. This is a super photograph of Chris Binney and his family on an outing with the new car. In the 1950s, people were becoming better off, and if you could afford one, a motor car opened up all sorts of new possibilities for holidays and for leisure travel. The 1950s was also a great time for children to be growing up after the lean years of the 1940s. Here we see a group of Bridgend pals posing for the camera in the Inch Park on a sunny summer's day. Chris Binney was a successful breeder of pigs for selling on at market. This is a photograph of Chris at Gorgie Market in 1963 after winning a major prize. He was to retire soon afterwards and sell Bridgend House to Harry and Doris Darling. The 1960s saw many changes at Bridgend. Chris Binney decided to retire and to sell the farm buildings. Harry and Doris Darling were already renting and working the land that had previously been Dixon's nursery and had closed down. There they grew barley for sale to the local breweries and turnips, which they transported over to the shops in the Glasgow area. They decided to buy Bridgend House, as it was known then, and as Harry put it, they turned Bridgend into a farm again. With the newly acquired Bridgend Farm steading buildings at their disposal, Harry and Doris were able to start raising a herd of Aberdeen Angus beef cattle. This is what the farmhouse looked like in around 1980, after it had been modernised and freshly painted white. Both the house and the garden have been improved and are in top condition. The house had previously been covered in a grey harling like many properties in the area. On the right of the photograph we can see the restored bothy, now a comfortable farm cottage. Here we have a super photograph of Doris and her prized flower tubs at the front of the house, and we also have another view of the old farm labourer's bothy, now a comfortable modern cottage. Harry was a great supporter of community activities. He tells an amusing story of how not long after he came to Bridgend, how he was persuaded to drive the local scout troop in their minibus to the summer camp in Oban and to go back and collect them a week later. All this just as a favour. Here he is on his tractor, pulling a trailer with a float for the Craigmillar Gala Day. This is a lovely piece of film given to us by Harry, I think it was taken in about 1975. He's working the fields at Bridgend at harvest time, and the collie dog seems to be having a great time running up and down following the combined harvester. Beside the field, and I think it's barley he's working with, looks like a whole field of turnips. He was a great grower of turnips and took them through to Glasgow by the lorry load to be sold in the shops there. You can see the barley being dropped into the back of a trailer. Presumably it would be taken to the farmhouse for bagging. And that's him carrying on. It looks fairly late on in the day, and I do hope the dog doesn't get in the way. The whole of that area was to be planted up with trees once he retired, and that view of the crags probably doesn't exist anymore. Yep, cheerio Harry. A new phase for Bridgend opened up after Harry and Doris retired. The farmhouse was sold to Edinburgh Council, but was left empty and soon fell into disrepair and became derelict, and the farmland was divided up and put to several different alternative uses. The bothy turned farm cottage was as old as the farmhouse itself. The extra space we can see at the gable ends above the tiled roof give an indication that at one time it probably was covered in thatch. This sad photograph was taken in the early 2000s, not long before it was demolished. In 2010, a small group of enthusiasts from the organic allotments next door had an idea to save the farmhouse and to restore it for community use. They formed a charity called Bridgend Inspiring Growth to raise money and to work together to save the house from dereliction, a huge task indeed. In the period before the restoration of the farmhouse began, Bridgend Inspiring Growth organised a series of community-based activities and training courses. Here we see a group of trainees practising their restoration skills on the stone wall on the east side of the garden. During 2015, plans for the redevelopment and extension of the farmhouse were developed, and a series of public consultations were undertaken. Finally, with all the plans completed and the funding in place, the ownership of Bridgend Farmhouse was transferred from Edinburgh Council to Bridgend Inspiring Growth, and shortly afterwards the restoration work began. This is a photograph of the old stairwell in the house before any restoration work had started. At this point, Bridgend Inspiring Growth were still drawing up their plans and raising funds so that the work could go ahead. And at one time this area of the house had been a lovely dining room. It was scheduled to be converted into the teaching kitchen. The restored and extended Bridgend Farmhouse was reopened in March 2018 by Harry and Doris Darling. Seen here with Will Golding, the chair of Bridgend Inspiring Growth, they were delighted that their old house had been given a new lease of life. The restored farm building has a popular cafe and a well-equipped teaching kitchen. There are also meeting rooms and exhibition and performance spaces. Bridgend farmhouse continues to be a special place in the community, as it has been for over 200 years. This is the outside area, showing the attached workshop spaces. The farmhouse is equipped to host a number of community group activities and to provide training in a range of subjects. The Arts and Craft Workshop is a popular and well-used facility, and there's plenty of good space for outside events and all sorts of gatherings and performances. We know that the farmhouse features in the lives of many local people now, particularly younger people, many of whom have moved into the new developments nearby. I have just one thought to end up on. Let's not forget that people, probably a bit like us, have lived in this area for many thousands of years. There are a few ancient remnants of their existence, and there's one in Ravenswood Avenue in the Inch housing estate. It's an ancient standing stone that was probably erected about 4,000 years ago. We have no idea who put it there or why they put it there. Perhaps in a few thousand years' time, people will come across some of our stones and wonder who we were and why we put them there. I've come to the end of my story about Bridgend. Bridgend's history goes back a long way, and it's a complex history. To tell the story in full would be quite daunting, and I really have only been able to scratch the surface. I've also only been able to cover relatively modern times, but I know that the whole story goes back a long way further than that.